Did you know that the U.S. and China together account for about 40% of the world's GDP, 25% of the world's population, and 28% of the world's carbon emissions? These two countries are the most powerful and influential in the world, but they are also the most competitive and confrontational. What would happen if they decided to make peace? To stop all economic sanctions and restrictions? Who will get the most beneficial outcome? As you know, the U.S. and China are the two largest economies in the world. However, their relationship has been marked by increasing tension and competition over trade, technology, security, and human rights issues in recent years. Since 2018, they have been locked in a trade war, which has affected not only their own countries, but also the global economy and geopolitics. But what if they decided to end their disputes and cooperate more closely on various issues? Who would benefit more from this scenario, and how would that affect their relations with other countries? Let's find out. The trade relationship. The U.S. and China have been engaged in a trade war since 2018, when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, citing unfair trade practices and intellectual property theft by China. China retaliated with its own tariffs on U.S. goods, and the two sides engaged in a series of negotiations and escalations that resulted in a partial trade deal in 2020. The trade war has had significant impacts on both economies, as well as on the global economy. According to a study by Moody's Analytics, the trade war cost the U.S. economy about $186 billion in lost output and 245,000 jobs by 2021. Another study by Oxford Economics estimated that the trade war reduced global GDP by 0.5% or $600 billion by 2021. The Biden administration has maintained a tough stance on China, but has also signaled a willingness to cooperate on areas of mutual interest, such as climate change, public health, and nuclear non-proliferation. The Biden-Xi summit in November 2022 was seen as a positive step toward easing tensions and avoiding further confrontation. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe. The economic effects of peace. We also need to consider the economic effects of peace between the U.S. and China. According to a study by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a full decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies would cost America $1.6 trillion in lost GDP and 732,000 fewer jobs over the next 5 years. On the other hand, a scenario where both countries reduced tariffs and non-tariff barriers by 50% would boost U.S. GDP by $160 billion and create 145,000 new jobs over the same period. Similarly, another study by Cambridge University Press found that the trade war reduced U.S.-China bilateral trade by 16% in 2019, and that a full normalization of trade relations would increase bilateral trade by 25% in 2020. These studies suggest that both countries would benefit economically from ending their trade war and restoring their trade ties. However, this does not mean that they would benefit equally. According to a report by Springer, China has been more resilient to the trade war than the U.S., as it has diversified its export markets, increased its domestic consumption, and invested more in innovation and technology. Moreover, China has also been expanding its economic influence in other regions, such as Africa, Europe, and Asia, through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Therefore, China might have more leverage than the U.S. in negotiating a new trade deal that would favor its interests. The impact of peace. What is the impact of peace between the U.S. and China on other countries? According to an article by The Diplomat, a recent summit between President Biden and President Xi showed an uneasy peace emerging between China and the U.S., as both leaders agreed to respect each other's core interests and avoid confrontation while acknowledging their differences and competition. This could signal a shift from a zero-sum game to a positive-sum game between the two superpowers, which could create more opportunities for cooperation and dialogue among other countries. However, this does not mean that other countries would be happy or relieved by this outcome. According to an article by Council on Foreign Relations, many countries are worried about being caught in between or forced to choose sides between the U.S. and China, as they have complex and interdependent relations with both of them. For example, some countries in Asia, such as Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia, are allies or partners of the U.S., but they also have strong economic ties with China. Similarly, some countries in Europe, such as Germany, France, and the UK, are members of NATO and the EU, but they also have strategic interests in engaging with China on trade, investment, and climate change. Therefore, these countries might prefer a balance of power or a multipolar order rather than a bipolar or a unipolar one. Benefits of peace. What would happen if the U.S. and China decided to end their trade war and resolve their other disputes, such as over human rights, cybersecurity, Taiwan, and the South China Sea? How would that affect their economies? According to a report by the Atlantic Council, a peaceful and cooperative relationship between the U.S. and China would bring significant benefits to both sides, as well as to the rest of the world. Some of these benefits include increased trade and investment. A full removal of tariffs and other trade barriers would boost bilateral trade and investment flows, creating more jobs and income for both countries. Reduced military spending. A reduction in military tensions and competition would allow both countries to divert some of their defense spending to more productive uses, such as infrastructure, education, healthcare, and innovation. Enhanced global stability. A more constructive and collaborative relationship between the U.S. and China would enhance global stability and security, as well as address common challenges such as climate change, pandemics, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and poverty. Who would benefit more? The question of who would benefit more from a peaceful relationship between the U.S. and China is not easy to answer, as it depends on many factors and assumptions. However, some possible arguments can be made for both sides. China would benefit more. One argument is that China would benefit more from ending its trade war and other disputes with the U.S., as it would avoid further sanctions and isolation from the international community, increase its economic growth and development potential, diversify its sources of technology and innovation, enhance its soft power and influence in regional and global affairs, and achieve its national rejuvenation goals. The U.S. would benefit more. Another argument is that the U.S. would benefit more from ending its trade war and other disputes with China, as it would reduce its trade deficit with China, increase its access to the Chinese market, protect its intellectual property rights, strengthen its alliances with other countries in Asia-Pacific and Europe, and maintain its global leadership role. So, what if the U.S. and China made peace? As we have seen in this video, this is a very complex and hypothetical question that has no simple or definitive answer. However, according to experts, both countries would benefit economically from ending their trade war and restoring their trade ties, but they might not benefit equally or fairly. In short, a peaceful relationship between the U.S. and China would have significant economic and geopolitical implications for both countries and the world. But did you know why peace between the U.S. and China would be difficult? That's due to China's ambition to challenge the U.S. and become a global superpower by 2035. Click here to find out more.